We've also...
We should mention maybe, because it was before I turned on my camera, that you work for the Lilligren campaign.
Yes, I am with the Robert Lilligren campaign. In fact, the reason I'm here is because we made it very clear to a lot of our supporters that if they needed, any assistance getting to the polls, that we would try to, make our way over and bring them over.
One thing I feel kind of sorry about, because I voted at this station for a number of years now, is I've never seen such a low turnout.
Yes, and the funny thing is, we've heard some folks saying that IRV would lead to a low turnout, and
what makes them say that?
I don't believe that. These are a lot of the opponents that they don't want to see a structural change. Now, their argument about why they would want the system to change is that this new difficult system would be hard to understand for new American communities and senior citizens who may find this a completely new system difficult. Well, frankly, they haven't. We've actually taken upon ourselves as a campaign to make sure that folks know, and we've also been blessed to have the resources that the city has provided that are, of course, nonpartisan, from either the city of Minneapolis or Fair Vote, Minnesota.
I think it did help me personally to look at the ballot before coming in.
Yes. The city lets you actually print off a copy, and so we've made sure to print off a copy for any of our supporters to let them know, or anybody in the ward. I mean, to be perfectly honest, as the incumbent, Robert has his first priority just to the citizens who
I've
live
talked
here.
to some of your opponents personally, and I guess it sort of opens up the field, doesn't it? How does it feel like inside your camp? Because normally you'd probably feel very confident that you're the Democratic endorsee, and now
it's... Not this ward. And, oddly enough, this ward is not a majority Democratic. A lot of folks would assume that being inner city, but it's funny, we actually have...
Quite independent, are we?
Very independent. It's a lot of... And I'm not saying it's a majority Republican by any stretch of the word. A lot of the folks are independent thinking, or Greens. We even have, some socialist folks here. And that's why it's important for Robert to make it clear that, we're honored to have the DFL endorsement. I mean, we are proud to be Democrats, but the most important thing is to work with anybody. In fact, our treasurer is not an outspoken Democrat, and that's great. She's still a great person, and we still are honored to have her with the campaign. Mm-hmm. And it seems like with this new voting strategy, it's not It's not important to hammer in partisan lines. It's not important to or it doesn't really make sense to be critical of your opponents or to be all that negative in general. The important thing is to focus on issues.
I've seen some interesting things because, for instance, Jean and Mike Tupper somewhat cooperated this time.
Yes. They've had events together.
And do you think that ever would have happened without ranked choice voting?
No, not at all. And
so it's brought in a new strategy.
We do think that and Andy Exley as well. And that's fine. We think it's actually a very we respect that strategy. It makes sense if you absolutely do not want a certain candidate to receive any votes, that you would try to develop a second and third. For us, it hasn't. We feel as though we want Robert to be number one. I personally support him for all he's done in the ward so far, and so that's our message is vote Robert number one. Above and beyond that, a second and third cannot hurt your first vote. So we certainly don't have any opponent we absolutely dislike. We haven't told people to rank the other ones.
Do you want to explain it to us as best you can understand it? What happens to the second vote today? When does that come into effect?
The second, it will only take into effect if your first choice is below the threshold.
And that's where the complicated formula. If there's only one seat, then you need 50% plus one vote.
Exactly.
But then if there's several seats, like to the park board or to the city council, then it gets fairly complicated.
That does get. It's that same amount. It's the amount of winners plus one divided, or you divide the total by the amount plus one. So for
4 seats, it would be 25% plus one then.
Exactly. Or the margin of victory would be. So if you take park board, for example, you've got the 3 at large, add 1, so you've got 4, so you need 25% plus 1 to achieve a victory, basically.
Mm-hmm. It makes it interesting tonight because I'm going to follow this all day long, and I wonder how many people will actually get sort of declared the victor today. I could see Mayor Ryback and maybe only a handful of others.
We're thinking that the city council races were a little bit more easier to compute because obviously there's just the 1-2, and so that's that's something we're grateful for in our camp. We're hoping that we can get the results as early as possible, and that it won't get too complex. But yeah, some of these multi-seats, I have no idea. I mean, I talk a lot with folks from in the party throughout the city, and we're trying to speculate how things are going to go, and it's anyone's guess. I mean, a lot of this is what we've seen at the doors. I mean, I know for my campaign, it's been great to go to as many doors as I have and talk to as many strong supporters and people who know Robert and love him and are going to be coming out. So that gives us a warm feeling. But there's some of these at-large city races that couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you.
What do you think is our mood as a perhaps nation, or at least locally? I've been to many meetings this year from the left and the right.
Yeah.
And I've seen this again and again. I'm afraid at these, say, healthcare fairs.
Yes.
Some anger and some, I guess, bipolarization, where we're really getting a division. It almost seems like we're losing the center there at times.
One thing, I guess for full disclosure here, I'll say that I'm a very active member of the DFL at large. I'm also with the Minnesota Young DFL and Stonewall DFL caucuses. And so I go to entirely too many events. That said, one thing I feel as I've been outreaching, doing canvas work with Organizing for America, for example, and in Stonewall, trying to excite voters who may have gone for Obama during the 2008 election, is this feeling that, well, we already voted for Barack amongst the left. That what else needs to be done? I thought we were just going to get health care. I thought gay rights would be a larger priority. Yeah, as many of us hoped. And so what I'm finding now as a political organizer, and granted I'm not your run of the mill citizen. I am a diehard political. I do think about.
But you don't look that old to me, so you haven't been doing this forever either, have you?
Nope, just
Did you start with this election? Oh, that's 6.
Yes, Keith Ellison was my first campaign, and I've got me hook, line, and sinker. I realized that people like myself, people who were, far lefties, who believed in healthcare for all, believe in a fair government. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have individual responsibility, but I believe that we need to have a strong government to protect us from corporate wrongdoings and and even government wrongdoings. I think we need to have responsible government, and that's why I felt a desire to join the government myself effectively and try to work for people that I hoped would be able to make decisions and get to know them to the level that I could interact. I mean, as a result of working on this campaign.
Do you feel because I felt it myself, I left my chair.
Okay.
And I felt actually great satisfaction and frustration at the same time, but I felt, I guess, so much better than just sitting at home complaining at the TV.
Yeah, exactly. And what I notice is amongst one person, it's difficult to really know what you can do, but what I notice is there are many of my friends who have the exact same opinions but don't do anything. And so if I'm able to go to a club or a bar on a Friday, and a bunch of my friends are able to say, Matt, we know you're really political. We wish you would talk about this, and then I can actually go to my local legislators or my local elected officials and tell them, this is the consensus. I feel like I'm making a difference. I feel like a lot of my friends are able to get that voice out, and that's why I think everybody who may feel as though they don't that their opinions aren't being heard. Well, they need to find other folks like them and need to find this consensus, because I think there are a lot of reasonable people that, completely disagree with many policies that have gone on the right and the left, that I think need to just be as outspoken as they can.
I found this surprise for myself, that it's not actually that hard to talk to them personally.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that has been, honestly, I think it's so interesting. I read all these issue forums, for example, of which, a lot of, you hear the most interesting things, and I try to keep tabs on local politics for both the Twin Cities. I've lived in both, and keep calling my home. But the interesting thing is, there's all these kind of speculative ideas that come up, and sometimes to the point of downright slander. And then I go and talk to these folks, or you go into their community hours. The other day I was knocking on a door, and someone said, how can I talk to Robert? How come he's only out here election time? Well, the reason is because he's in City Hall or in his office other times. He's working really, really hard. And, it just goes to show that a lot of elected officials, especially local, I mean, I'm not saying I can, just pick up the phone and, get a hold of, Joe Biden in an hour, but I could get in touch with my local, Congress folk if I absolutely needed to within a week or so. I can get in touch with my, state house member, my state senate. They're very accessible. You can just set up an appointment and usually go into their office, within a week or so. And that's one thing that's really gotten me excited about politics, is being able to tell my friends that, we really do belong in this government. This is, for the people. If we
dive right in.
Yeah, exactly. If you have something reasonable to say, if you have something that, really you truly believe will make society better, and there's enough people that you can convince along with you that it will, then I really think we can, actively make some changes. And, as far as this new voting system, I'm not sure. I've heard the arguments for and against, and I'll tell you, as someone who's worked as hard as I have on a municipal campaign, it's been a great opportunity to talk to people. And, one thing that I've noticed, and this is it's just a funny thing about campaigning, is you knock on doors and people get kind of interrupted at all times with these campaign messages. And a lot of folks who aren't, as politically engaged as myself really don't want to hear about what someone's done. They don't want to hear about someone's resume. They don't need to hear all this, because either they know the candidates already, or they're a little disinterested. But when I'm able to bring up the voting system, it has stopped some folks. And one of my kind of favorite happenings is,
what kind of impressions did you get from that? That's really interesting to me.
It's mixed. You have a lot of especially the younger folks, or younger demographic, under 4 years. I mean, this is really rough, but
that are just starting to vote.
There's been a lot of younger folks like, this is this new cool system. Let's give it a shot. I really wonder how this is going to work. Or a lot of them are really excited about, third parties. I myself, really, took good time to look at all the different parties and figure out, what really lines up with me. And I feel that there are, even though I am a DFLer, there are things to be taken from the Green Party and from the Independence Party, for example, that I think I'd like to see integrated, into the DFL, or at least I know a lot of, activists share those opinions. And so that's one thing about IRV, is it allows you to look at all of them, and if you really support some opinions, you can make that heard. The flip side is I've had a lot of folks who are just kind of wondering, why would you, in this economic time, would we spend all this money? And one thing
has it increased the cost much? I guess the hand voting will be expensive. Or the hand counting,
thing.
I mean.
I don't actually work in City Hall, so I certainly can't break all the numbers down for you. But what I have, spoken with Robert about, and what I've talked about with Ona Keller, who works for the city, is that there is a budget of a few $100,000 for staff, but that does not at all account for a lot of the printing that's done. And I'm certainly not the one to give an exact amount.
Might also need all new voting machines.
Yes, and that's the thing, is we will. But one argument for that is we're going to need new ones in 2010 anyways. And so that was, that's the reason why we are using our original machines now, is why get new ones when when they're going to be outdated in a couple of years anyways. We really should, or next year. So that's not something I'm too concerned about. And even though I feel that, yes, education does cost a bit. I mean, it does take a lot of time. And, for us, there have been there's evenings, for example, that we could have, been knocking on doors or phone calling, that instead we were doing it at voter trainings. But, those have been some of the most fun we've had of this entire campaign, because they're still talking to voters. And even though we're not, at those trainings, necessarily drilling folks about, why they need to vote, we're still helping people. And as a result, people have, just gotten to know Robert as a person, not just as a candidate, but just as someone who has been, an activist in his neighborhood for years. And, they see him pull up in his bike and realize the type of guy he is. And that's been a lot of fun.
Does he vote here? Where does he vote? Do you know where he
votes? At the Ebenezer Tower high rise.
Oh, I know where that is.
Yep. And actually, that's where we had one of our trainings, and it was a lot of fun.
So then you talked about young people having enthusiasm for it, but out of the Ebenezer Towers, what did you find coming out of that?
Well, one thing I've heard some opponents say that senior voters wouldn't understand it, and I think that's just slander. I mean, frankly, these are
Often
these
they
are people that
follow
completely get it.
politics quite closely.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's kind of insulting to say that any one demographic would be really confused, because part of it is you just need to educate folks. And there have been some people who have questioned it, but have been a little confused with the math. But I'm a little confused with the math. I think all of us are a little confused with some of the finer details of the.
I do look forward to seeing this maybe in 2 to 3 months and really thinking about it and evaluating it after the fact.
Yes. I think it's going to be a great retrospect. I mean, part of the argument for why we wanted this, or why a lot of progressives wanted this, were larger races. I take 2000 in particular. I mean, obviously a progressive from how I've been talking so far, and I would have preferred for a lot of folks who really have liked Nader to have been able to picked a second choice that was more progressive than their third choice would have been. And that could have been quite a different election, which is interesting because at a municipal race I'm not sure if we're gonna see the same type of overchange. That said, it gives a lot of folks the opportunity. And I mean, in our race, we have 5 opponents. We've seen a lot of folks come out, and that's great. It's one of those things that it's made our life a little bit more difficult on a campaign level. And I certainly can't say if I had
So you've been
no
losing a little
it'd be
sleep
easy.
though recently, haven't you? Did you throw out lit last night?
I'm a campaign director. I always lose sleep
So
over things.
were you
I
out
do.
walking last night?
Yeah. Oh yeah. And it's we walked over the entire ward, and
And yet, are you going downtown tonight?
Oh, of course.
I'll see you there. What's your name, please?
Good. Matt Sampson.
Thanks, Matt.
Sounds